This is A World on Purpose.
A purposeful life is the most important kind and the most valuable kind of life.
Every choice that we make makes a difference, for better or worse.
I loved walking in a village and seeing the before and after.
This is the podcast dedicated to those humans choosing to live larger by working for the greater good. And these are their stories. Stories of hope and of true change that come from living on purpose.
What if you were to suddenly say there are no challenges, there are only opportunities?
Regardless of where you come from, your financial identity should determine where you end up in life.
I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris, and my hope is that my inspiring guests will take you on an introspective journey that helps you tap into your own pivot to purpose, bringing greater meaning to your life. Welcome to A World on Purpose. When you hear the term public relations, do you associate that with a job designed to create media buzz just for entertainment or politics? You wouldn't be alone. But for trailblazer Mahdis Keshavarz, founder of the Make agency, she took her exceptional talents and vast networks in PR and steered them in a direction towards the world of social justice. Listen to Mahdis share how this was not only an area in desperate need of PR support, but also something that gave her greater meaning. Mahdis also shares how her journey toward founding her agency wasn't just deeply rooted in a desire to do good, but was also shaped by her childhood as an Iranian immigrant in the United States.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to A World on Purpose, your podcast with everything purpose-related. I am so thrilled today to have an amazing guest on my show, someone that I've had the privilege, the honor, and the gift of knowing for quite some time. And as you know, on this show, we like to bring people that are going to be really interesting, inspiring, and help you sort of figure out your journey if you're looking for guidance into finding meaning and what your mission and purpose is in life. And this is a really unique show because we're going to be talking about the world of public relations and how purpose ties into public relations, which is really, really exciting, I think, and be a very interesting thing for you guys to learn and know. So I am welcoming my guest today, Mahdis Keshavarz, founder of the Make agency, and she's coming to me live from Los Angeles. Hi, Mahdis. Welcome to A World on Purpose.
Hi, Alyssa. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
I am too. This is very fun. It's fun. Actually, we were just talking about how we got to dress up for the first time in what seems like a decade, almost, right?
I was going to compliment you on your perfume. You smell very
Thank you. I did spritz myself a little bit, just, so if it were a scratch and sniff screen, that would have been really cool. I know. So, we've talked a little bit about the show and about what we're trying to do here. And I'm really, really excited to be able to give people information around and a kind of a bird's eye view inside to the world of public relations, but from a unique perspective, because you have created this incredible agency and sort of took the idea and your skill set and your talents in the world of public relations, but really moved it towards a very niche, unique area of social justice. And so with the Make agency, not only are you the founder of that, you've been a producer for Rebel Music TV, you are an Arab and Middle East Journalists Association, and you have all these incredible organizations you've done work with, like the United Nations and BBC World. So what I'd love to do is kind of let you tell your story. It's great to be able to read someone's bio, which is super impressive and wonderful, but this is your chance to have a voice, and I would love for you to tell us how you came to be, how Make agency came to be, and also what I call your pivot to purpose within your origin story, when that moment was in your life when you realized you didn't want to just be about profit, but you knew you had to do something that was extremely meaningful and put you on that path to purpose. So please tell us your story.
You asked the hardest questions, Alyssa. Before, when someone asks, where do you find your purpose? I don't think I've ever been able to separate purpose from contributing to society. I think that is my purpose. And I think I would like to think many of our purposes here on this earth is to be able to make society and the community around us a better place. And so the circumstances for my own life have been that, I was born in Iran and my family had to come to the United States for a myriad of reasons. And I grew up here, but with always a political awareness, of who I am and where I'm from and the circumstances under which I'm living in this country. And so I think making that connection really allowed me to have a really global view as I was growing up. And that was really helpful for me in terms of deciding what my career moves were going to be and how those moves could really contribute to a broader purpose. And for me, I went to the University of Washington, and upon graduating, I decided to make a move to New York City because I really wanted to work with the United Nations. And I went every which way to try and get an in. And I ended up getting an internship with a side project that at the time it was called the Hague Appeal for Peace. And it was really lucky for me because they were working really closely because they'd become a project for the Secretary General's office. At the time was Kofi Annan. And so I worked really closely with his office and was able to do all of this work around this initiative called the Hague Appeal for Peace, which took place, of course, in The Hague and was marking the anniversary of an initiative that had taken place some 100 years prior. And for me, it was the first time where I realized I was very young at the time, and it was my first job, and I started as an intern. And sorry, I don't know where that beeping comes from.
Is that your computer or my computer?
I don't know. I don't know how to turn it off. If it were mine.
It's okay. We'll live with it. It's a forced quit. I was taught that by my podcast producer. But we are in COVID times, and we are just moving and grooving with it. So go for it.
Grooving with it. So hopefully it won't happen too often. So basically I went to start working with his office. And at the end of that term, I was told that I needed to have a new job, and what could that possibly be? And during my time working with the Secretary General, they had hired a PR company, and that PR company approached me and they said, "Hey, we know you're in between contracts with the UN. Why don't you come and work with us for a while you figure out what your next move is?" And I had enjoyed the process of reaching out to press and media, and I wanted to be a diplomat at the time. I was like, well, I'm a diplomat. I'm going to try this. And so I went, and I ended up staying there for a really long time, about 7 years. And for me, it was this really interesting marriage of realizing that I could work in a kind of a corporate type, fast-paced environment. But around PR, it also allowed me to work on a lot of different projects that I really cared about and to see them through, not necessarily to solving the issue altogether, but to seeing meaningful impact along the way by how I could change public perception. And I was really lucky to be able to continue to work with the United Nations in that context because we were hired regularly by different arms within the UN to do these different initiatives and projects. But really, it also allowed me to understand how I can serve as a bridge between different communities, most often my own being Middle Eastern and Muslim, in the early 2000s was a really critical period. And that allowed me to really establish for myself a niche, in a market. And after about 7 years, I decided I wanted to start my own company, which is the Make Agency.
Only 7 years?
I worked with that company for 7 years, and I started Make Agency 12 years ago now. Almost.
That's pretty impressive, actually. To get that kind of experience in only a short 7-year period of time, and then take that leap of faith to dive into your own agency is gutsy. It's not easy, right?
I think when you look back on it, I have been really lucky to have some really incredible mentors in my life. And to take a moment, I want to shout out a particular friend of mine, Alex Chung, who people now know, what I have known for a really long time is that he's a genius. He just started and sold a company called Giphy, which has really also changed the way we communicate on the internet. But he's been my friend forever and ever. And somewhere around 2007, he said to me, he has a nickname for me, Maddie. He's like, "Maddie, stop. What is wrong? Why don't you just start your own thing?" And it was this crazy light bulb that went above in my head. And I was like, wait, I can start my own product. Are you kidding? I can start my own company. And he was like, "What's wrong with you? Yeah, you do this and you do this." He helped me pick out a name. He helped me come up with the logo. He's, and of course I've had a ton of support along the way, but it's just that aha moment. And I look back on it and I'm like, it's scary to start your own company. And I think something about youth gave me that drive.
Right. You're a lot more brave in a youthful environment. That's for sure. So that's fascinating because, to have gained all that experience and then take the leap in an area where, public relations, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about how the landscape has changed quite a bit since now and then. But when you did that, what was it specifically that made you want to not just do traditional PR, but specifically the term of social justice? Obviously working with the United Nations and all that things, but how did you know to shape an agency that was geared towards that area of need? And what was your process in developing that? And how did you find clients? Did they find you? Did you reach out to them and just addressing that immense need, which probably wasn't serviced, I'm guessing, very widely at the time?
It wasn't. It was not. I think that in this day and age, I think the time that we're living in now makes you look back on your own past and reflect differently on like what brought you here, you know? And I have found for myself that much of the difficulties I face living in America as a minority, as a woman, as a Muslim, has really shaped me to kind of look on the fringe a lot of times. And I found a home on the fringe of many times. When I was younger, I was a punk rock kid. As I grew up, I was, you know, into like weird music and art and all those things, and communities where people might identify as the weirdos, you know, and simultaneously being part of an immigrant community, and not just one immigrant community, but many different immigrant communities that made up the fabric of the people that I surround myself with. And that really helped me build relationships. So going into my work life in my early 20s, I had maybe a different perspective of things because I saw myself on the fringe. And I found that many of the other people around me that were living on the fringes weren't being represented. And it was a really difficult time in that way, because after 9/11, especially, I found that so many of my community members were struggling and suffering, and the press and the PR people and the people, the attorneys and all the people that were around them at the time didn't reflect who we are, you know, and I was Middle Eastern, and I knew the reporters at the New York Times, and I knew the history of what brings people to make certain decisions or to feel a certain kind of way, or to have a certain kind of faith in things. And I think that that allowed me to be a bridge. And by seeing that I could serve as a bridge between that community, I realized that my connections would also allow me to serve as a bridge to many other communities, not always to speak on their behalf, but to allow them to amplify their own voices, and that I could be a vehicle for them to use for their own empowerment. And that was really something that allowed me to design a business model, so that after a while I was working a 9 to 5, I wish it was 9 to 5. It was much longer than that. Doing PR, I ended up, you know, representing all the Guantanamo detainees after 9/11 and everybody that was shipped there. A really unpopular at the time initiative to take on. But I was chosen to do that work because I worked with the Center for Constitutional Rights. Their vast experience around death penalty cases made them familiar with representing the unpopular, and what they had done in the 90s around Haitian deportees with HIV to Guantanamo had given them a really unique perspective. But doing that kind of really gut-wrenching, grueling type of PR, where calling journalists, they were, you know, getting hung up on, being told that you're a traitor, all these awful things, I needed to balance that out. And when I went home for the night, I would go out with my friends, because I was in my 20s and had the energy for that. But we would go out, and I was like, oh, you're artists and you're musicians, and they needed PR too. And I realized that there's a path to reaching people that doesn't always have to be hard news, that sometimes you can reach them to arts and culture. And that really allowed me to see that there was a purpose there for me to do work. And that's what I did.
I think it's so genius that you took that avenue. And I remember a conversation you and I had once. You know, a lot of the things we do sometimes, and what shapes what we decide to do in life comes out of, quite honestly, childhood experience. And I remember you sharing with me when you were a little girl, feeling like you didn't fit in, and having experiences of people, you know, kids are amazing, but sometimes they can also be very cruel. And so I did this kind of speak to you doing this work out of just what you experienced growing up?
110%.
An immigrant?
110%. I'm really, really lucky. I talk a lot about my parents, my dad especially, but my mom and my dad, both of them, when we first came to this country, really struggled for various reasons, you know, but really about fitting in. And I really struggled around fitting in, about having parents who didn't speak perfect English, about eating food that wasn't the norm at lunchtime, about myself not really speaking English until I was pretty well into elementary school. And I think that when you reach that point, you know, you have to make a decision about whether it's going to break you or not. And I'm super, super lucky that my parents sat me down and said, you can do a lot of things in your life, but you can't let them break you. And that has really fed me in my life, you know, that sense of entitlement that they gave me, the knowledge about where we come from and who we are and what community and family means, has really fed me in my life. And I think it's allowed me to do a lot of things that other people would and did tell me were not possible to do, or were not for me to do.
Right. I think that's so wonderful. And I mean, the word entitlement, when you use it, doesn't mean, it doesn't have the spin that some people would associate entitlement with. It really was about having a self-esteem, like being able to have that sense of self that I'm worthy and that I matter. And which I think is super, super important for so many of us who've grown up with diversity, adversity, and lack of diversity, or, issues around that. So I think that that's really amazing. I want to dive into, really like the Make agency, like the kind of clients you've worked with and how you've taken your own personal experience, that narrative that you grew up with, that amazing inspiration your parents gave you, and all the experience you had at the UN, and talk about how you turned that into this incredible machine that's been doing this great social justice PR for a long time. And we're going to do that in our second segment of our World on Purpose with Mahdis Keshavarz and Make Agency. So we are going to wrap this first segment. I can't believe how fast it went. There's never enough time for all of this. It just doesn't make sense. So why don't you tell people where they can find you, and then we'll lead into the next segment and really dive deep into the weeds about all the incredible work you've done with the Make Agency.
You can find me at www.themakeagency.com.
Great. And then all of your social handles and all those other things will be
on it as at the Make Agency.
Perfect. We love that. And we'll also have it on worldonpurpose.com as well. So you'll be able to see all the incredible work that Mahdis has done. And so please tune in to part 2 of the 3-part series around Mahdis Keshavarz and the Make Agency, because it's going to be really interesting. If there's anything you ever wanted to know, not just about like social justice, but also the PR world and how that works as well, and the new media cycles and all these interesting things that are happening, you're going to learn that next. So please tune in to A World on Purpose Part 2 and 3 coming up soon. Thank you. I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris, and we'll see you in the next segment. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to A World on Purpose. I am your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris, and I am so thrilled to be able to dive into part 2 of a 3-part series with my amazing guest, Mahdis Keshavarz of the Make Agency. And in part 1, we talked a lot about her incredibly moving personal origin story coming from Iran to the United States, and her life, and how she got involved in public relations as a business, and how that evolved into her incredible own agency, taking that giant step of bravery into building her own, something she owned herself. We're going to dive now into sort of what that means, what that looks like to have a PR agency that specializes in social justice, and talk about some of the clients that she's worked with through her agency, and what kind of meaningful, tangible impact that she's been able to make through those relationships. So Mahdis, welcome back to A World on Purpose, and thank you as always for your time and just being here and sharing.
Thank you, Alyssa. It's cool to do anything with you.
Well, I appreciate it. It's a mutual adoration society, so we're really blessed. So we were talking a little bit about how you took this incredible journey into starting your own agency. I can imagine in the PR world in general, it's got to be difficult anyway, because you're competing with a lot of other people that are trying to capture the attention of media outlets, et cetera. But let's talk a little bit about what that looks like for something that's specifically in the niche of social justice. And then if you could share with us some of the amazing clients that you've worked with globally, and some of the work, some of the specific initiatives and things that you have done with them to really create tangible difference in the social justice space. That would be super.
I was thinking about that the other day, because I was talking to certain people and they bring up stuff, and I was like, oh yeah, I worked on that. I know about this. And I had a situation where somebody was doing something around organizing work, and they said, oh, you have to do this particular model. And we had a contentious disagreement about what their model was. And I said, you need to send me proof of where you're coming up with this idea. And they sent me a 2000 draft of something I had written. And I said, it doesn't work. And they said, how did you know? And I was like, because I wrote this, it didn't work. And so you realize how much time passes sometimes. And to see my own work recycled, I was like, wow, I'm offended, but wow. So I've worked with a lot of people. I've had a really, really blessed kind of history of being able to work not only with the United Nations, but with teams ranging from MTV to BMW to, world leaders like Queen Noor and Desmond Tutu, and just really, really incredible opportunities in my life, alongside being able to work around cases and issues where people have been on death row, that have been exonerated, that have been, incredible musicians and artists that have made real contributions to how we see the world and how we view our own integrity in response to crisis and challenge and adversity. And I've been able to build a company and really a community around that. And I'm super, super lucky and grateful every single day that I have that, because it allows me to draw on so many different perspectives.
Oh, I can only imagine. And working with world leaders in countries that often don't get probably a lot of support from agencies, especially if there's anything controversial that they're working on. Was there anything in particular that you worked on over the last 12 years that just, not the current projects you're working on, because we'll touch on that in part 3, that I know are you're so passionate about and meaningful, but a few examples of some of the projects that you led and really were able to aggregate incredible positive press around and awareness and able to make a difference in the lives of the people that you were trying to support through your agency?
Gosh, Alyssa, you asked so many things, and when somebody asks you that, despite you're thinking about these projects in so many different ways, you end up drawing a blank. You're like, which one was it that's like my favorite to pick?
Why don't we talk about, what did you do? Obviously, a very well-known name, too, that you mentioned are Desmond Tutu and Queen Noor of Jordan. I mean, what was it? Is there anything you can speak to about what you did with them that they were really passionate about and trying to make change with your agency?
One of the ways that and it wasn't necessarily during the time of Make, but just before, when I had the opportunity to work with Queen Noor, and I'll talk about Archbishop Tutu a bit later, but really with Queen Noor after 9/11, I think one thing that really touched me was was reached out to by a friend of mine, Emily Jasser, who's a very famous Palestinian artist. At the time, she was on her way up, but now she's at the top. But she called me. She said, Queen Noor is coming. She lives in New York, and she's in New York, and she wants to help the communities facing, this adversity, because up and down in Brooklyn on Atlantic Avenue, which is just a short jaunt from where I was living, people were boycotting the stores and really having a different reaction to 9/11. And these shopkeepers who were where I did my groceries were really suffering, and they were where I ate and all those things. And so Queen Noor approached me and asked if I would be willing to give a tour, to help give a tour of the neighborhood and who was there. And it was a really incredible experience, because it was in one of those moments where it was a bridge. I was like, oh, Emily was able to bring this client. I'm able to give this time and invite these journalists. And the journalist, who at the time had a very virulent reaction, if you think about 9/11 in New York, after that time, people were justifiably angry and furious and mistrustful and living amongst us together, and not recognizing that Middle Eastern community and the Muslim community was in the same amount of pain and mistrust and hurt, and that we were affected in an equal, and if not in some ways more profound way. And so to be able to finally have something to call the journalists and be like, hey, this really incredible queen who grew up in the United States and has a story that you can all relate to is offering her presence to walk around Brooklyn with us. And they came because for whatever reason, the way American press works, they were like, oh, wow, sure. And so they came, and we went to these different grocery stores, to a Yemeni restaurant, to Yemeni cafe. I think it's still there. Shout out. It's the best food you can get. But we went to these different shops, and the shopkeepers were so grateful. And it was really just not them not knowing. I was just some girl who used to show up and have dinner at their restaurants and buy my different spices. And I showed up with Queen Noor, and they were like, what is going on? And I think to this day, for some of those restaurants in New York, when there's the ones that are still there, when I show up, they're like, oh my God, how's Queen Noor? But that was one of those moments that got a ton of press. And I think for the first time, it really allowed people to see the humanity of us all, and the fact that we are neighbors, and that, that kind of a crisis affects everyone and in different ways. And we have to hold on to one another's humanity and seeing each other that way. So that was one thing that I took a lot of pride in. And later on a few separate occasions, I've had the privilege of working with Archbishop Tutu, and some years later in 2003, where there was a United for Peace and Justice march against the war with Iraq and Afghanistan, that I had the extreme privilege of leading the press and outreach for, and Archbishop Tutu, again, offering to be there despite his frail state at the time. Everything was also another example that at any age and despite any adversity, that we all still have a voice, and that we all still have a body, and that body being present in opposition to something that we feel is unjust is probably one of the most powerful choices that we can make in life. And staying awake till 2:00 in the morning in my office and sleeping there and reaching out and doing stuff, I realized that 1 million people showed up that day. not just because of my efforts, but because of a collective of people that were dedicated and believed in a similar thing. And history has shown that we were right, and so those are things that I think that I've been really, really proud of to work with and to do. And there's been many, many, many more. I hate, like, clients sometimes end up like being like your babies. You don't want to pick one because everyone has had such a just and wonderful cause. And some of them are still fighting for that cause.
Right. And I think if anybody's curious, obviously, about all the clients you've worked with, it's on your website, and it's a pretty impressive list, to be honest. And I love that you called those two out, actually, because I think it's important for people to understand that, obviously they were dignitaries that were coming up and standing up for injustice and really being supportive of that. But that the fact that you were able to get the press to come out around these extremely controversial issues at the time, it speaks to you too, and how you were able to tell them that story. So let's talk a little bit about, thank you for sharing that, by the way, because it's really incredible. And I think it takes a special skill set probably, and ability to not convince, but just compassionately convey to very hard media outlets why these kinds of things are important to cover. So let's talk a little bit about how things have changed in PR since you first started all that time ago. I mean, we've had conversations about, just the way the media cycles are. I mean, you're the kind of, by the way, public relations agency that is not just able to just blast out press releases. You have the power and the connections to pick up the phone and actually call high-level reporters on something that's meaningful and powerful to you. How has it changed over the years, and what has it done to affect your ability to tell those kinds of narratives that matter and get press outlets interested in these kinds of things from a positive, spin?
So I think that when I started doing PR, my boss at the time had a stack of papers that were fax cover sheets. And when it was time to put press out, I had to stand at the fax machine, and it could be 100, it could be 200. I'm dialing in the number and waiting for it to go through. And I was like, hey, do you know there's this thing called email? And he was like, yeah, it takes too long. I'm like, it doesn't take any longer than a fax. I just need to type in, And so I say that only to say that between 2000 or 1999 and now has been, leaps and bounds of change. And I was there for a lot of it. And the beginning was so exciting to be able to utilize an email and to tell 10 reporters at once, as opposed to call 10 reporters at once. And it gave me a unique perspective. One, because I give good phone. Like, I can talk to anybody on the phone. I can get you on the phone. I mean, somebody wants to do some multi-level marketing, I could have done it, So you can call me on the phone. And I enjoyed, especially at the time, talking. And then around email, I was like, I have an ability to come up with a hook is what we call it in PR, to get people engaged and to watch and to listen and to pay attention. And that really, those two things allowed me to do something that's been critical in my career, and I think is critical for anybody else starting out in any kind of entrepreneurship, and that is to build relationships. And building relationships is a reciprocal exchange. It is a give and a take. I cannot always ask a reporter to give me something if I am not also offering something. And that was explained to me pretty early on in a myriad of different ways. And I've held on to that. And that relationship building has been what's able to carry the Make agency this far. And I think that being able also to continue to maintain those relationships, not just when I have a story to sell, but when there's a birthday party and when someone's going through a hard time, or when someone has a great story on the front page of their publication, or they are being slammed for another reason. I don't have a problem picking up the phone or sending a text now and saying, hey, congratulations, good job. I think those are kinds of some of the things that help carry through, but the landscape has shifted dramatically. And I think Facebook and Google have been really detrimental in many ways. Some people who follow the press and media understand that in the early 2000s, when they started limiting the way that we share information and introduced this concept of verticals to, news organizations. And there was a huge pushback. And I don't think, unfortunately, that the American public really realized what an important moment that was for free speech and for long form journalists and for journalism, period. And journalism lost that battle. And the time since, in my opinion, and I think that a lot of people would corroborate, is that what became of PR as influencer culture rise and this obsession with celebrity and internet, social networking kind of stuff rose, that it has really been a detriment in many ways to journalism and to PR, especially because the value of actually having the relationship was eroded in favor of being able to tweet at somebody, in favor of being able to buy likes or to manipulate results. And that became what the norm for PR was. And I really refused to do that for many people, because it's not possible for me, in terms of my own integrity, to say, okay, well, we are going to manipulate the results of this so that I can get, if I don't get public opinion to legitimately shift, I'm not changing anything for my clients. Mm-hmm. I need to find that path to have true change happen amongst us. And that can only happen with meaningful conversation and patience and discourse. And that's been really challenging, I think, the past few years, as I've seen the shift in this country, to continue to do PR the way I want to do it,
Right. I think that that's such an important point that people probably don't understand, and with the invention of social media, I think, would you say that it's also sort of diluted the ability to get really solid, truthful, fair and balanced news?
Yeah, absolutely. None of us are really immune to the effects of social media, and much less journalists, and journalists have become beholden to it because they're held accountable on it. They have to compete with it to get scoops and to put the information out there. And it's become a speed game, where it always has been a game of speed. But at this point, you sacrifice accuracy for speed, because someone else who maybe isn't from the news culture, it has a higher demand on you. And then there's bots and things that can push back in ways that aren't about journalism, but are about shifting public perception. And again, it's super dangerous.
Wow.
It's super dangerous.
Wow. It must be somewhat disheartening in a way to have watched, something you loved so much as an industry have to be forced to change and pivot and figure out ways to adapt. But also there's sometimes some genius in that as well. And I think we can kind of touch on that in how you're implementing your genius and the ways that you do things with some of the causes that you care about specifically. So we're going to touch on that in part 3, which we're going to be coming up on. And this has just been so educational and really interesting. Anyone who's interested in pursuing the PR world, a lot of it's around celebrity, a lot of it's around what some people call fluff, but I don't know if that's necessarily, everybody doesn't feel that way.
Celebrities. I work with loads of celebrities.
I love celebrities too.
Good. I just want them to be using it for good.
Exactly. And I think that that's why it's so nice that you have this agency, because it shows you that you can get meaningful work done and still have all of those qualities, like with your artists and your musicians and things at the same time. So why don't we tell people where we can find you, and then we will wrap part 2 and dive deep into part 3. I can't wait to talk about these initiatives that you're involved in. They're really exciting and meaningful and doing such great good. So Mahdis, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Find me at www.themakeagency.com.
Fantastic. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning into part 2 of part 3 with Mahdis Keshavarz, Make Agency on A World on Purpose. Do not miss part 3, because that's where we're going to learn some really incredible stuff that she's working on, very relevant to now, and really learn about how, if you want to get into the PR world, what that's like, and just some advice that she's going to give us with some tools and tips that she's learned along the way to stay the course. So everyone, thank you for tuning into World on Purpose. I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris, and we'll see you in part 3. Hello, and welcome back to A World on Purpose. I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris, and today we are diving into part 3 of our incredible series with Mahdis Keshavarz and her amazing agency called The Make Agency. It's a specific agency geared towards and around social justice, which is really an interesting, unusual place that PR could think about going, and that she has mastered. So I'm here with Mahdis. Mahdis, welcome back to A World on Purpose.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so we've talked about some really interesting stuff in parts 1 and 2, your personal origin story, which is incredible, coming from Iran to the United States, and how a lot of that work that you were able to translate from a child into your young adult life, working with the United Nations, and then segueing into this incredible agency that you've built called the Make Agency, which specializes, as I mentioned, in social justice. We're going to dive into some of the causes that you particularly care about, having worked with so many different clients that are living a purpose-driven life and really trying to affect change. You embody that as well as yourself as a human being. And it's such a remarkable thing that you do. So we're going to touch on that in this segment. But before we do that, I just wanted to get in a little bit about the United Nations. For anybody who might have a misunderstanding or not really quite get what the United Nations is all about, I think that there's probably sometimes people have skepticism around governmental agencies and things like the Sustainable Development Goals, and how are these agencies really affecting change, boots on the ground? And I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit for people who would love to understand more about the UN, because it's such a big entity and everyone's heard of it, but I'm not sure that everyone is educated about it. And I would love for you, having been in the trenches with them, to just give us a little bird's eye view into the UN.
Sure. And I want to say, I totally understand and have my own set of criticisms about the United Nations. It's not a perfect organization by any stretch of the imagination. It just happens to be really the only one we have as a global community. Doesn't mean it's not room for improvement. I certainly don't advocate for it to be abolished, as some do. But I think there's room. And I think one way that this past year of 2020 has really shown us, I think, the importance of having international cooperation. And despite all the criticisms for it, the purpose of the United Nations is meant to be a way and a place for the world to convene and to talk about important issues of the day. And subsequently, to offer resources as they are able per country to then disseminate and address some of those issues domestically and globally. That's a very bird's eye kind of description of what the UN's meant to do. But I think in 2020, with the advent of the pandemic, COVID-19, that we've seen the importance of international cooperation through institutions like the World Health Organization. And I know that it's really difficult, especially for those in America, to understand because it's been so deeply undermined here. But the idea of it, if I can just offer, is that the World Health Organization is meant to be kind of a clearinghouse for developments that are happening. There are teams of scientists that are extremely, extremely well qualified from all corners of the globe who are doing research around different kinds of pandemics or illnesses or disease that is happening around the globe. And because nothing's been more clear than 2020, that disease and germs can spread, and they can spread globally and rather quickly. It is really critical to be able to have a network of medical teams that are experts in science to be able to share that information and to understand collectively what they can do to stop it. And that holds true along lines for politics and borders and all sorts of other things, which makes the UN a critical piece. And I think understanding that and looking at the UN in its perfect description and sense as an umbrella for which people can feed information, conflict, disease, strife, and to be able to share that information in a way that benefits us all would be an ideal way of getting the UN to work. When that does not happen, people lose out. People who are already marginalized and on the fringes don't have access to those who may be more advanced in their technology or their knowledge about certain things. It is marginalizing people further. And it marginalizes people at the top as well, because there's so much to be learned from indigenous and minority voices, rural areas that may actually be using plants and other, modes of medicine to solve disease or to address conflict or to build community, or to look at social justice or human rights issues. So it is meant to be a place to exchange ideas and to exchange information. And I think the more we shun that, the more we shun discourse and the more we shun collective benefiting for one another, the more we find ourselves in a state of despair and of aloneness, and I think that that's where I personally struggle a lot, because I have found great solace in the global community in so many different ways. And I find that whether that's in the UN or really it's just my personal life of being able to travel and to learn from these different places, it would be a pity if we as an American society decided that that wasn't worth pursuing.
Mm-hmm. I think that information is really important for people to hear, especially because there's so much of the global community is now rallying around these sustainable development goals, right? That were created 20 years ago now. We have 10 years left to achieve them, apparently. And it's really a framework, right? To give people an idea of how they can shift their own purpose-driven mission, whether it's around oceans or poverty or SDG 5, lifting women and empowering women and girls. And I think hearing you explain how that works for people, I think is really important for people to know. Do you feel like if there's one thing that people could do to support the United Nations and be part of that, is there something that you could give people advice on that they may want to rally around, whether it's their company or their NGO or something specific?
I have really, I have to say, Alyssa, really become an advocate for the belief that in order to make effective change these days, you got to look in your own backyard and you have to look at yourself. There are, images of starving children and strife and war all over the world. And we have a responsibility to those people. We have a responsibility of awareness and we have a responsibility of advocacy. But if we can't first solve our own home problems, our domestic issues, we can't see how that actually is contributing to their oppression. And I really believe that deeply, is that I can't live in my nice Venice home with my wonderful privilege and advocate for people if I'm not also advocating here. If I can't advocate for people in Yemen, if I'm not also acknowledging that the U.S. government is complicit in that. So I don't need to go to Yemen, nor do I need to do, many other things. What I do need to do is to call my representatives here, to have discussions with people here, to understand where my tax dollars are going. So I think we see the UN as kind of supposedly being something that's supposed to solve all problems, where really our governments are accountable to us, and then they must do what we tell them. And we can't lose sight of that, and I think the culture in America has increasingly been to outsource problem solving. And problem solving begins with you, with me, and so does integrity. If we're going to compromise on those things, then let's just give up now. But we also have to then give up criticizing other people for how they do it.
That is exactly what I thought you would say. And exactly the perfect message, which is a great segue into the kind of work you do, because you really can't affect change unless you've had personal experience and unless you've tried to figure out a way where you can actually help affect change in your own backyard or in a cause of something you're passionate about that means something to you. So let's dive into that. That was a perfect way to explain how it's important for you to step up and step forward and show what it is that you can do, because that whole concept of, think globally but act locally is super, super effective. So let's talk a little bit about that. You're working on these incredible projects right now, Minority Rights International and a refugee project. Which one do you want to start with? Because they're both incredibly powerful and both do kind of a little bit of different things.
Sure. I'll start with Minority Rights Group, if I may, and that kind of segue to Refugee Health Alliance. I'm very lucky that I've been able to serve on the council of an organization called Minority Rights Group International, and I've been able to work with them much more deeply this past year for a myriad of different projects. But their mandate is to amplify the voices of minority and indigenous peoples around the world, and they represent a huge amount of people from all over the world. And we have cases now, for example, of the Ogiek people who are a forest people that live, a forest indigenous community that live in the Mau Forest in Kenya. And they have been evicted and targeted within the forest for many, many years and are one of the most oppressed minorities within Kenya. But 3 years ago, through the work of Minority Rights Group, they have been awarded the African courts, which is, higher than the Supreme Court in Africa. It's the African court, has identified them as having an ancestral right to their land in the Mau Forest, which has set a huge precedent, not just within Africa, but across all borders, to really acknowledge that indigenous people are critical to the land from which they come. And they won this huge settlement. And unfortunately, in recent weeks, under the guise of COVID-19, the Kenyan government has refused to abide by the ruling and has been evicting them from the forest once more. And so we've been doing a lot of work around raising awareness about that. And so those are some of the things that I work on with them, in addition to identifying hate speech that's happening in various parts of the world that range from Pakistan to now we're seeing in Ethiopia, where online issues, especially when you look at social media again, which is what we talked about, is identifying that a lot of these social media companies are the news source for the region. So in places like Burma, Myanmar, they, for the Rohingya, when you ask people what's the internet, show me the internet, they will take you to their Facebook page, because that's the internet.
Wow.
And similarly in Ethiopia and other places in Africa, for example, and I believe the Philippines as well, is that when you say, hey, how do you surf the internet? Well, like, well, here's my Facebook page. So you can imagine how much that opens the window for really dangerous exchange of ideas and hate speech and bots and different things that really target minorities and indigenous people, and the kind of conflicts that we've seen with the Rohingya, what that means for these communities. And so we've been really privileged to work. I've been very privileged to be able to work and observe the work of Minority Rights Group International and seeing how they are developing different kinds of lexicons and reports that identify how we can stop hate speech in its tracks. And they can really only do that because they have these contacts on the ground and these relationships for the past 50 years with these institutions, with these different indigenous communities and minority communities. And they serve as a bridge to the European Union, to the United Nations, to different governments to be able to advocate and amplify the voices of these different communities. So I'm really, really lucky. It's an issue that's really near and dear to my heart. In addition to the many different clients that I have, that I encourage people to also remember, because in an era where we're talking about minority issues and indigenous issues, we can't actually forget those communities and recognize that they extend far beyond the Amazon, and that they exist here in the United States and in virtually every country on earth. There are still indigenous marginalized communities. So,
right. And do you get to find that with all of your relationships that you have in the press and with media outlets and specific reporters, that you're able to help them tell that narrative for you and in a way that's positive and meaningful, or are you getting response?
I mean, Alyssa, I think everyone would agree that right now the media landscape is pretty difficult. When you look, there's so much news and it's moving at such a fast pace. And we are living in an era where chaos in terms of information dissemination is being rewarded, and it's becoming a new model. And I don't envy the people that are in these newsrooms in terms of being able to categorize and prioritize these kinds of stories as they come. Yes, we do our best. And we often have reporters, and I think this is where my life comes a bit full circle, is that by maintaining these relationships for so long, I know which reporters to call, and I don't email. I can get you on the phone, or I can get a WhatsApp introduction, and I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to tweet you, and then I'm going to Facebook message you, and then I'm going to email you, and I'm going to do it till you pick up the phone and talk to me, And I think that if I'm lucky enough to have a relationship in advance, people will listen, if I'm lucky enough to get somebody who's willing to hear me out and to hear my clients out and to make that connection as to why it's important, it's lucky. But it's become much, much more difficult, much more challenging. And you can imagine with indigenous communities and minority voices, sometimes it's difficult because they don't have the same access to have a smartphone to have documented their action from the forest, and to be able to have an internet connection where they can quickly upload that, and to have there's challenges that we take for granted. And I think that we as a society also need to recognize that we've done wrong by these communities for many, many years. And now we're in a state of climate duress and political unrest where we may actually have a lot to learn from these communities. And we have to rely very heavily on their knowledge and their expertise. And we can't do that if we don't build a meaningful relationship and to prioritize them at the table, to prioritize their expertise, and to really do right by what we've done so wrong for so many years.
Right. And I'm guessing, too, that as a creative public relations expert, you're probably looking, and we'll talk about this at the end because we will do a call to action for these two causes that you're going to mention, but that you're probably thinking of creative ways to get just everyday humans involved, I'm guessing. So we'll just, right? You want to see if you can, instead of mobilizing the press, how do we mobilize regular, ordinary day humans that care into action? Is that right?
Which is the perfect segue for me to talk about the other thing that's really dear to my heart is that, I think people that are listening probably can pick up, or watching, I should say, or kind of pick up that I've had some issues with disillusionment about my craft and those challenges. And one of the pivots that I made is that a few years ago, after, frankly, the travel ban taking place in the United States, me being separated from my family in Iran and my access to be able to see them largely, that I wanted to do something. And I was having a hard time with PR too, because I felt that I've been giving my years so long to fighting against Islamophobia, and to have this administration push back in this way unjustifiably and without true cause and reason is a slap in the face. And I didn't feel that I had, and I say I as a community member, had the ample support to see that follow through. Yes, I know people took to the streets. Yes, I know, but I don't think enough people did. because that passed and we didn't put enough pressure. And I haven't been able to see my family since 2017, and that, I think people don't see the pain that puts. And simultaneously looking and seeing what's happening in Europe in terms of the mass exodus of people that are leaving their countries for a myriad of reasons that Americans kind of are willfully ignorant about and oversimplify, was really challenging to see. And I think if I was in a different place in my life, it would be kind of the time that I would pivot and say, I'm going to go and work, in the field and in a camp someplace or directly on the ground. And that's just not tenable for me, realistically. I have a family and I just can't do it. But I moved to Los Angeles from New York, and I live 2 hours from a border that is one of the most difficult red zones, I think, for people. And it is largely overlooked what's happening in Latin America and the exodus of people that are coming from all over the world to find a better life and to frankly find safety from climate duress, from political duress, from domestic violence. And that border was increasingly problematic, and I wanted to do something. And I realized that there's a few things that I can do. One is that I had started a kind of a creative project on the side that's called the Polite Society, that is a greeting card and recipe gift kind of company. That it was a personal project, but I did it because I knew that from the income of that I could kind of contribute still, just strictly financially, from proceeds from that to different causes and issues that I care about. So Polite Society had been born, and I realized that it also had freed up some of my time, and I still have all my contacts. So my dear friend, Ronika Mukherjee, who is an amazing force of nature, who I have known for 20-something years and has volunteered her time in the slums of India working with HIV-positive sex workers, to the streets of Tahrir and Cairo during the Arab Spring, had said that she is going to take her medical expertise and go to Tijuana. And so I called her and I said, guess what? Can I help? Can I come down there? Can I volunteer? It's 2 hours. And she said, yes. I was like, I have no medical skills. I can put on a Band-Aid. I have a child. And I was like, but I can bring you some medicine. I can donate some money. Let me see. And she's like, okay. I was like, well, how much money would help? And she said, I don't know. Could be like, maybe if we get $1,000, we could buy a bunch of food. And I was like, okay, I could do that. So I just put out there on my Facebook that, hey, I'm going to go down there personally because I know that there's a lot of mistrust in the world today. You guys know me. You know who I am. I am personally going to go down there. I will buy everything that you need. And if anyone gives me money, I will put every single penny of that back towards these communities that need A, B, C, and D supplies that they have identified to us. It wasn't me deciding for them. I want to be clear. Right. And so I ended up raising, to date, I think, Alyssa, we've raised close to $100,000 through different means, which is incredible. And I tell you that amount is from my friends, period. It is from my friends, $5, $1, $3, and certain people have given much, much more than that has helped us get, and it's an ongoing effort, but to be able to go over the border 2 hours away and be able to serve the communities there as the community is asking to be served is an incredible gift and a reminder that each one of us has access, every one of us.
That's right.
And that pivot to purpose can happen every single day in the decisions that we make, in little micro moments, at the grocery store, at how we view somebody who is, housing challenged, at how we view somebody who's having a mental moment, every single one of those is a pivot to purpose because it's a pivot to our integrity. And it's a pivot to recognizing what we're going to be like as humans and what kind of people do we want to be? What kind of society? And we can't look at each other and point a finger until we look at ourselves and lead by example to ourselves. Like, what do I want to be and how do I hold myself to that standard? And I think we're forgetting that while constantly being reminded of that. Right. So I think it's a lesson we need to learn.
Right. I agree. So I heavily agree. And I it really gives us an opportunity to identify how we want to show up in the world, right? Not just for ourselves, but for others. And that's a really interesting example too. That's a little bit of the opposite of social media being a vehicle for positive change, right? You mobilized your entire network and your community without having to really have a single media story about it. You were able to raise those kinds of funds from a very...
I didn't want it. It's a security risk for the people that are there. There's nothing in it for anyone but me, really, to be able to be like, oh, and that's not been my purpose. That's not the kind of PR. Right. If I wanted to be that person, I would have been on the other side of the PR.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, and the fact that you even just took that moment and said, this is something that I know that I can do. And whether you knew you were going to be able to do it or not, you just did it. You put one foot in front of the other. You made the attempt, and then you were successful. And that's really what, living in a world on purpose is all about, taking that first step. And we don't know for sure what the outcome is going to be, but most of the time, if we just lead with that intention, lead with the intention of living in a world on purpose, with purpose, for purpose, then we can make those kinds of incredible, tangible results. And I love that you did that. I think your Giphy friend needs to have you have your own Giphy.
I was working with him about that.
I think we need that. We need that as a hashtag, so you can use this for all of your incredible stuff. Well, this is just so amazing. I wanted to close by, first of all, just one more thing, asking people, if people are curious about PR, curious about if they should step into that realm or not, because they aren't sure if it's going to be hard or if it's going to be meaningful. What's something you could tell them if people are looking into that specifically, both doing it themselves as a profession, but also how they would utilize somebody? And then we're going to do a call to action now to find out how people can help support you with the minority rights groups and your the refugee project. Sure.
So if you want to get into PR, that's a tough one these days. It's hard. I'm not going to lie. I think PR is it's one of the toughest industries that's out there right now. And it's also one that's under a lot of challenges and a lot of evolution. Some people say it may not be around in X amount of years because you can do much of what people think I do by tweeting at people now. So building that Rolodex or finding that reporter is much less difficult than it was, in 2000. And so I think that there's an evolution happening. And if people want to do PR, I think they really need to do some soul searching about what that means for them. What is it about PR that they really want to get into? And what is it that they want to advocate for? If you're passionate about products and selling products and things, absolutely do it. But how is it that you're going to link that to a purpose? Are you going to do it in a way that demands of your clients to be equitable? Are you going to do it in a way that demands that your clients that you take on in order for you to do press for them need to live beyond the kind of slogans that they're putting out there? Do you know that their labor sources are equitable? Do you know that they are actually reinvesting in the communities that they're trying to sell products to? There's a million ways of kind of doing that. And I think, again, it starts with our own integrity. I started, as I said, as an intern, and I was really lucky that I only had to intern for about a few weeks before really proving myself and being able to pivot to a paid position or a programmatic officer. And so that was really lucky for me. But I still tell people a lot of times that if you can afford to volunteer your time for some period to see if it's really your true calling, you should try to do that. And then I simultaneously tell companies, if you are taking on interns, you must provide a stipend for them to be able to allow them to couple of hours. So I think that there's a lot of challenges and changes that has happened since I first started PR. And like I said, I don't come from a place of huge privilege, but compared to some, I definitely do. And I was privileged to be able to go to New York and to volunteer my time. I paid for it. It wasn't there wasn't a trust fund that did that for me. And so so I say that it's possible. It's just challenging, and it requires a lot of creativity and creative thinking and resilience.
Yes.
Resilience. They're going to tell you no, and that's fine. That's the only word they know.
Right. And it's okay because it just makes you stronger, right? That whole thing of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Yeah. That's great information. Thank you so much. So let's wrap this by telling people how they can help support your two initiatives. If there's a specific ask for each one, what would it be?
I would say that for Minority Rights Group International, you can go to Minority Rights, and up the upper right-hand corner of that beautiful website, you hit Donate Now or join the newsletter or Get Aware, but I would be very grateful. You can follow them on Instagram or social media at Minority Rights. So on Instagram, please follow us. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. And the same with Refugee Health Alliance. Refugees and migrants along the border with Tijuana and San Diego are in dire need. COVID is a major issue that's going through there for all these different communities, and they have next to no resources, especially as the Mexican government has basically extracted themselves from the equation at the beginning of this year. So please give to Refugee Health Alliance as well. You can find their website at refugeehealthalliance.com. They are based in San Diego. and we could use every cent. Tell them I sent you.
Yeah, please be sure to tell them that she sent you, because that's when you name drop. It always helps,
Please.
right? That's a little PR tip.
Yes.
Mahdis, thank you so much for doing this.
And I hope that your listeners actually also know that you have this community around you, because you walk the walk and do the talk so much and are so present, and for your friends and for the community, and are such a beacon of knowledge yourself, that we're all really lucky to have you, and that your encyclopedic knowledge of wellness and health is something that should not be undermined. So I hope that your listeners are just as grateful to you as we are as your friends.
Thank you.
And happy early birthday.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, thanks. I'll be older by the time this comes out. Well, thank you so much, Mahdis. And it's just been a pleasure. And for everyone who's tuned into A World on Purpose, I hope so much that you've gotten some incredible, valuable knowledge and information about how to find your pivot to purpose. Please go to aworldonpurpose.com to learn more about Mahdis and the incredible Make Agency and all the initiatives that she discussed. And tune in to our show on a regular basis, because you're going to meet more incredible people like this over and over and over again. And hopefully we will inspire you to find your pivot if you haven't found it yet. Thank you so much for tuning into A World on Purpose. I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for taking this journey into A World on Purpose with our incredible guests. To learn more about our amazing guests and their inspiring purpose-driven work, please go to aworldonpurpose.com. Don't forget to look at our call to action of the week to mobilize your desire for purpose into action. A World on Purpose can be found on Apple Podcasts and all the major podcast platforms, and the video version can be found on YouTube. If what you heard today inspires you, please write a review and like and share on the platform of your choice. We'd love to also hear from you and learn your pivot to purpose and the meaningful work that you do that lifts humanity. Send your stories to info@aworldonpurpose.com. I'd like to thank our World on Purpose team for making this show a reality. Once again, I'm your host, Alyssa Fisher-Harris. Thank you for tuning in to A World on Purpose. I look forward to seeing you soon.